Awesome. So I will drop the schedule spreadsheet in the chat once more because everyone's full bios are on there. Everyone has some really, really long list of accomplishments that will take honestly forever to read through because y'all are amazing people. So I just want to briefly cover a little overview of what folks are up to these days. So Vivian recently graduated from UT Dallas with a bachelor's in neuro. Congrats, Vivian. She recently shared a photo of her graduation cap with a lovely little brain on it. If it's around, Vivian, would love to see it in the flesh, but otherwise we'll have to pull up the photo sometime. Oh, she's gonna get it. Wonderful. And Vivian is heading across the country. Oh, there it is. Look at that beauty. Seems like a lot of work went to that. Yes, congrats once more, Vivian. She headed to the University of Pittsburgh, UPitt, for a Master's of Public Health and MPH in Human Genetics. So an interesting take to the MPH program there. Patrick is currently a PhD student at Boston University, involved in mathematical neuro, computational neuro, and also passionate about educational reform. And then Elizabeth is a second-year doctoral student over in Texas at the University of Houston, where they're in the developmental cognitive and behavioral neuroscience program. So we'll definitely be learning a little bit more about their backgrounds, their interests today. And also want to set the scene and saying that questions are very, very encouraged. We want this to be as interactive of a Q&A as possible. So you'll notice that the unmute permissions are enabled right now. So you're always welcome to raise a hand, ask your question out loud, or you can always drop them in the chat and I can be your voiceover person, like one of those cool TV shows where the narrators tell that very formal voice, right? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first, why grad school, right? Why are you going to grad school? You're doing more school after undergrad too. That's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of was involved in that decision to apply to even further education? And where do you perhaps see yourself 10 years, 20 years out? It's one of those big interview questions always. Who would like to start?
I guess I can start. Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, especially coming out of like Zoom University and then also just like 4 years is a long time. And yeah, for me, I was applying for grad school while still in undergrad. So if anyone has questions about applying for grad school while still in undergrad, I'm more than happy to talk about that. But yeah, I think for me, it was like, I was interested specifically in like public health and genetics. And so just for this field, and also because I'm interested in doing research, there are a lot more opportunities for public health and research at a graduate level. There still are some like that you can do like with a bachelor's degree, don't get me wrong, but it is like a little bit more limited. And so that's one of the biggest reasons why like I was like, I want to go to grad school. Also just like to learn more just in general about like the field of public health, because public health for me wasn't really on my radar until like COVID happened. And so that's kind of when I first started hearing like about public health in this field in general. And so having come from like a neuroscience degree background, didn't really have the opportunity to do too much in public health. And so kind of wanted to take an opportunity to like focus more on public health specifically through grad school. So yeah, I highly encourage everyone actually, even if you think you know, like going into undergrad exactly like what you want to do, to kind of just like branch out, explore a little bit. Because I definitely didn't know when I was going into undergrad what I wanted to do. Like I knew I kind of liked healthcare, but I didn't know exactly like, oh, like do I want to go like be a doctor or like do I want to like be a nurse? Like I didn't know. And so I think that's why like college is especially really great for that. It's just like being able to like try different things and like study different things that you didn't get to like in high school. So yeah, that's kind of my reasoning for going to grad school.
That's a great answer. And I'd love to circle back to that idea of exploring during undergrad and realizing that you might be interested in pursuing grad school in a completely different direction from undergrad. So let's return to that point as a second question. Elizabeth, I can pass the mic over to you.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. So I had it pretty easy when it came to deciding to go to graduate school because I got my bachelor's in psychology, and there's like no jobs once you get a bachelor's in psychology outside of like research assistants or behavior technicians. You can't do anything as an actual career with just the bachelor's. So my kind of question was figuring out, do I want to go to medical school? Do I want to do something like clinical psychology? The applied therapy, applied research, or do I want to go into basic research like neuroscience or developmental psychology? And I wasn't too interested in doing a lot of therapy. I wasn't too interested in managing medication. So by determining that, I was able to kind of rule out medical school psychology, clinical psychology, and really focus on like neuroscience, developmental psychology. I am in a developmental cognitive behavioral neuroscience program, which is quite the mouthful. But to put it simply, it's kind of the intersection of psychology and neuroscience. So in that way, I'm able to still get kind of that applied research aspect, but really combine that with basic research, which I really enjoy. So I had it easy compared to many others.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And let's, last but not least, hop over to Patrick.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so I was also in an interesting position. So I ended up applying out of my undergrad as well to graduate school. I never thought I would go for a PhD though. Originally I came in and I was pre-med. I was doing all the pre-med requirements. I completed all the pre-med requirements. And so, you know, for folks who are interested in that path, I'm happy to chat about that as well. But I decided that while sort of getting experience for med school, I really loved sort of doing basic research, applied research, all things research. So I had a ton of different roles in my undergrad, both within my institution and outside in the nonprofit sphere. And I realized that I just really had this joy of, you know, investigating difficult questions and writing papers and trying to communicate with folks from around the world on those topics. So around my junior year, I decided that I was thinking more of a graduate school path. What's interesting is most people who will go to their PhD, at least in neuroscience, they don't go straight into their PhD. So most people will either do a master's or some sort of like a research assistant position. And so I actually applied to all three at once. So I applied to PhDs, masters, and research assistants at the same time. One reason why you might want to do a research assistant is first, you actually get paid more than you do as a PhD student, and sometimes, unfortunately, as a postdoc as well. It depends on the institution. But it's also a great way to sort of get more skills, figure out what field you might be interested in. It allows you to pivot more easily to, you know, certain graduate programs, because something that's interesting, particularly about PhDs, is you don't typically have to go into the field that you got your undergraduate degree in. So for example, with neuroscience, you'll see a lot of people who are math majors, physics majors, computer science majors. Psychology is sort of just, you know, related to neuroscience. So that's, I guess, not a fair comparison. But, you know, sociology, for example, so you really are can have a breadth of experiences to go and do that work. So I applied to all three. I wasn't really sure, but in the end, I think, you know, I was really excited about Boston University for the advisor that I was going to work with when I arrived. You know, it also was great that, you know, it is paid typically for a lot of PhDs, at least in neuroscience and math. And so, you know, I could sort of go and sort of treat it like a job, you know, start putting money away as much as possible on the stipend, and then also just do something that I really love. The last consideration that I'll share for going to graduate school so early, as opposed to waiting, you know, a year or two, was that, you know, PhDs take a long time. So oftentimes they'll take at least 5 years. So my program is a minimum of 5 years. I do have funding for that, which is exciting, but that takes a long time. Then typically you'll do something after called a postdoc. So that's basically where you have your PhD, you'll go and engage in either at a university or in the government or at a private company to get more skills. And then usually you're more eligible for like, staff scientist roles or, assistant professorships or things along those lines. So for me right now, I think I'm interested in academia. I love teaching. TAing was a big part of my undergraduate career. It's something I do in my PhD. Not a lot of jobs in that area right now, so we'll see how that goes. But that was sort of why I decided to go right in.
That's true. Academia does feel like the wild, wild west sometimes. Yes, but wow, applying to 3 at one time sounds very chaotic. So glad things worked out. And so Patrick and Vivian, you guys both applied straight through to PhDs and MPH schools. Elizabeth, I just want to make sure I didn't miss, were you applying to graduate school while you were still in undergrad, or did you take a gap in between?
So my intention was to apply straight during my senior year of undergraduate, but I actually ended up graduating a year early. So when I would have taken my 4th year, my senior year, I actually ended up taking a gap year, which was right when COVID started. So I applied during the early pandemic.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Wonderful. And going off of Patrick's, one of the last points, that program duration, perfect segue into kind of looking at differences in duration of different graduate schools, especially because the PhD timeline is a little bit very flexible compared to more like terminal degree programs. So Patrick, you mentioned about 5 years. Elizabeth, how long approximately would you say your PhD duration would be?
So my PhD program is designed for you to get your master's while you're getting your PhD, which most PhD programs are designed that way. So even if someone came into my program with a master's, they'd still be in the program for about the same length as someone who doesn't have a master's. So my program is designed for a minimum of 4 years, but we get funding, I believe, up to 6 or 7 years, and then we have a maximum of 10 years before you're unfortunately released from the program. I would say, I think my program average is about 6 years at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, 6 years is a long time, but I'm sure it also flies by when you're having fun doing research. Wonderful. And then Vivian, how long is your MPH program?
Yeah, my program is 2 years, which is pretty standard for master's programs in general, but yeah, especially MPH, 2 years.
Wonderful, thank you. All right. Also wanted to go back to the point of pre-med. So Patrick, you mentioned you were pre-med, but then considered graduate school. Elizabeth, you were also thinking about pre-med, considered graduate school as well. Vivian, are you planning on going straight into the workforce after the MPH, or are you considering applying to graduate or medical school in the future, further graduate school?
No, I think I'm just gonna go straight to working after my MPH. So yes, this is it, hopefully.
No more school. Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, would any of y'all be able to elaborate more on kind of the undergrad to master's to PhD pathway? Because Elizabeth, as you mentioned, some PhD schools have that master's embedded into the duration, but Patrick, you also mentioned that some folks kind of use the master's as a stepping stone to more graduate school. So can you chat up a little bit about like why people might be interested in doing those avenues, especially since you're kind of hinting at the fact that you don't necessarily have to be in the same field for your PhD as your undergrad. So it'd be great if we could explore some of them, the reasons that students might want to consider a master's if they want to pursue a PhD in the future.
Was that for me or?
For anyone.
Cool. I guess I'll start. So one thing I'll mention is that there are a lot of different types of like PhD programs in the sense of like how they're structured at least. So as it was mentioned, like there are definitely a lot of programs where there are master's degrees. And so one thing that some people do in math, for example, is they'll might apply for their PhD and they're allowed to sort of get paid for 2 years, sometimes through teaching assistantships, sometimes through an advisor having a grant. And they'll be able to leave with like their master's without sort of having any issues. So they get like an option before. Typically, the distinction there is a PhD student and a PhD candidate. So a PhD student is someone who is in the early stages before they take qualifying exams. So they're still taking classes. And then once they take qualifying exams, oftentimes they'll no longer take classes and they're considered a senior PhD student. And so that's someone who's like, basically, supposed to focus on their thesis, develop new, threads or whatever it might be. Typically, you might have to like publish at least a paper or something. That depends on the school as well. Even depends on the department. So at least in my area of like computational neuroscience, it's very interdisciplinary, and so there are actually very few strictly biologist focused people in my area. And so when I was mentioning masters or research assistantships, they still have to have a lot of neuroscience knowledge. And so it's a way to sort of close that gap. One thing that's kind of cool, but also unfortunate is that, as things get, I don't want to say like complicated, but more advanced in a particular field, the more skills you're required to have. And so, even the typical graduate program in neuroscience at BU, where folks aren't computationally focused, they'll still have to know how to code, for example, in 1 or 2 languages. They still have to take certain math classes and things along those lines. And so you might do a master's degree outside of your institution to sort of fill in certain gaps. One reason you shouldn't maybe do that is the cost. So it's really important to sort of think about, why do you need those skills before a PhD program? Are you able to pick that up through what are called leveling courses at the PhD? So sometimes you'll, take an extra year or 2 at the PhD if you have funding to sort of take the classes at the university that you're getting your degree in, so you don't have to go elsewhere, and they pay for it because it's important for your research. So it really depends on the program. And so it's really important to sort of do a lot of research on the actual programs you're interested in before you make a decision one way or another. Research assistantships, as I mentioned, oftentimes will get you the same experience before going on to do a PhD that you might be paid for, get health insurance, et cetera. So, there's a lot of different reasons why one would be better than the other for different people. So it's important to sort of know your circumstances in relation to what you want the degree for.
Thank you. That was very, very thorough exploration. Anyone else want to add on any additional info?
Yeah, since you were asking about like why someone might consider doing like a master's as maybe like a stepping stone toward like another degree or a higher degree, I think some things that some people might want to consider is like, what is your end goal? Like, and like, let's say like if your end goal is like med school, I actually also was kind of considering pre-med for a little while. But yeah, I've seen some people who like end up doing a master's because they're trying to like improve their GPA and also just kind of gain more experience like at a graduate level. So there's some things that you should also consider, like if you do end up wanting to go to like professional school or like graduate, like PhD school and things like that, is like what's on your resume, like how's your GPA? But you don't have to do a master's to get experience or improve your GPA. You can also just like take other courses like a community college, or you can just like spend like a gap year working instead of just like applying straight. I think, yeah, not everyone like applies straight to grad school from undergrad. And yeah, I really only like recommend people who are after like 4 years, they're like still like okay, not stressed out, not burned out. Like those people, I would say like, okay, like go for it. But especially like with COVID, I've seen a lot of people kind of feeling that burnout. So if that's kind of where you're at, where you're like, oh, like, I don't know if I can like go straight into a graduate program, like right after, then like, you don't have to. But yeah, some things to consider. Like if you like, if that is your end goal, a master's program is like an option to like improve GPA and also get more experience. It's also like you can also get better rec letters that way too, because with undergrad, oftentimes your class sizes are going to be like humongous. So it's kind of harder to really get to know your professors that way too. So if you're looking for like a better rec letter with someone like a professor that you might know a little bit closer, graduate classes are much smaller than undergrad. So another thing to think about.
Yeah, amazing points mentioned. I really appreciate you bringing up the point about burnout. We're kind of like joking about like more school, like yay, more school, but it's also like school is tough. It's intense. So definitely jumping from 4 to even like 5, 6, up to a decade, like Elizabeth mentioned, of school, that's a lot. And especially if you know, are paying for tuition and in case of a master's program, some people choose to work in between in those gap years to definitely kind of offset some of that heavy financial hit. So a lot of different factors go into taking that gap year as well. And some of y'all might have even noticed that in recent times, we've started shifting the way we talk about gap years to even saying glide years now to get some of that connotation out of like, oh, we were taking a break. Because people have very valid reasons for taking that break in time between school to do a lot of other pursuits as well. That could even involve traveling to like Peru or, you know, South Africa and having a great time relaxing as well. Yes, wonderful points there. Let's see, we have a question in the chat. Going back to Patrick. So what is the difference between normal neuroscience and computational neuro, or perhaps could just elaborate on what the discipline of computational neuro entails?
Yeah. So I think we're still figuring that out. It depends on who you ask. So most folks who don't consider themselves like computational neuroscientists still have a computational component. So in that sort of class of folks, it's people who will use particular algorithms to analyze data. So whether that's through like exploratory techniques of like, hey, we have all this data, but we don't really like know how to analyze it, or we're not sure what we're looking for. So some folks will do something like that. That's particularly common in cognitive neuroscience. That's something that I'm actually doing right now with my former undergraduate advisor. So that's one sort of form of computational neuro. Another form is where people will sort of have a lot of biological knowledge. So particularly from like what's called like neurophysiology, where you're interested in sort of like the cell-based circuits, for example, of a particular system. So it might be like, you know, someone's eyes, like working with vision, or if you're interested in hearts, like how like the heartbeats, for example, is typically considered like a simple circuit system. So, or at least relative to cognition. So, you know, I think basically the common thread is that you use very heavy mathematical or computer science techniques to do your neuroscience work, but it doesn't really revolve in any particular area. In the sense that it's not just cognitive neuro, it's not just biology, but rather it's people across the spectrum. So oftentimes on papers, you'll see like a million different authors. Most of the time in present day, you'll have at least 1 or 2 people who are like computationally focused on there, doing certain analyses, helping design certain algorithms to successfully complete the work. So what I do, I'm actually even though I take classes in the neuroscience program at BU, my advisor's in the math department. So like, it's sort of like going between all of these different schools to sort of better ask and answer questions in neuroscience.
Wonderful, thank you for sharing. We have a lot of questions coming in, and before we jump to them, I want to ask all of y'all, what does your day-to-day look like? What does your day in the life of graduate school look like? Vivian, I know you're starting grad school in a couple of months, but if you could also just give an idea of what you're expecting to see, that would be really wonderful. Elizabeth, would love to start off with you.
Sure. So I do developmental cognitive neuroscience is kind of my focus, and that entails running human research studies with infants and toddlers. So a lot of the time my day revolves around 3 to 4 hours of running studies with infants and toddlers. So it's a lot of screaming, a lot of crying. We do a lot of eye tracking and EEG. So sometimes they have to wear a hat and they're not very happy about that hat. But that takes up most of my day-to-day is running studies, especially after COVID. We're trying to make up for those 2.5 years that we weren't able to run human research subjects. Outside of that, I also have class. So that's usually 3 to 4 times a week. I have 3-hour classes. So that can vary depending on what day of the week it is. And then a lot of meetings. We always have meetings for individual projects. I have meetings with my advisor. I might even have meetings with my class professors, depending on what assignments are coming up. And then outside of those 3 main things, running studies, taking classes, and managing my meeting, I'm trying to fit in everything else. So all my data analysis, all of my data coding, any independent learning that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to learn how to code, which is a challenge in itself since I had no classes on that in psychology degrees, which is a gap in itself, in my opinion. Also trying to balance volunteering and stuff. So it does take a lot of flexibility. I work a lot of weekends or evenings, but I'd say that's just something that comes with the territory of graduate school. And you can't really say for sure what your day-to-day is going to look like. It's a lot of switching things around just to kind of make things work.
Absolutely. Sounds like a very busy schedule, but very fulfilling at the same time. So that's really wonderful. Vivian, we can jump to you.
Sure. Yeah. So as Shimai said, I won't be starting my program until August. But I have enrolled in classes. I'll be taking 15 hours, which is pretty standard, I think, for the MPH. Everyone takes 15 like a semester. And I'll be taking mostly like introductory courses, so things like intro to public health, like intro to human genetics, because that's my concentration in public health. Yeah, but something else to kind of that I'm like also going to be start working on like in my first year is I'm not sure how it compares to like a PhD dissertation, but for my MPH program, I do have a thesis. And so like the first year is going to be kind of honing in on like what are my interests and what I want to do on my thesis. So I will have an academic advisor who I'll be meeting with monthly to kind of like figure out like, you know, what I want to do. And then eventually I'll also have like a thesis mentor and then like a thesis like review committee who will like sort of like be working with me and helping me develop my thesis. And then at the end, once I have this long thesis paper, I'll get to present that to them. So yeah, not involved or haven't gotten involved in any extracurriculars just yet, but I want to. Kind of seeing like what is there at Pitt, like for public health students or grad students, or just what's around on campus in general. But yeah, really excited.
Yeah, it's gonna be exciting. You'll have to keep us posted. Awesome. And then Patrick.
Yeah, so you know, sort of like everyone's mentioned, you know, there are different sort of phases to every program and things along those lines. So for me right now, I have to take 3 classes. So one's a systems neuroscience class, which is terrible, but super fun. And, you know, you learn a lot of things. It's just difficult. So systems neuroscience is essentially like treating the brain as a series of different like functional circuits and sort of taking a biological lens to how those circuits work. So I have one of those classes. I have a data analysis class that I have to take. And then I sort of have like a Frontiers in Neuroscience course where like it's kind of almost like a journal club. So you read a paper, someone presents on it, and then there's like a critical discussion of it every week. So the number of classes you take definitely varies depending on what you need and what's required for your program. But right now I have a 20-hour research requirement. So I have to be in the lab for at least 20 hours on top of those classes. So my research is actually using neuroimaging, but only outside of the lab. So I also use EEG and fMRI, but I don't physically run the studies. I am analyzing the data. So particularly in this field called functional connectivity analysis, I figure out how different brain regions are communicating during a particular task. So right now it's during episodic memory, but in the future I'm moving to other areas. So that's sort of where I'm at. So I'm actually either at home when I'm doing my work, or I have like an office space so I can do it on the computer, but I'm actually not in the lab. So not everyone has to sort of be in the lab for sure. I do have to have an experimental component in my PhD though. So if you think you can get away with doing one and not the other, you'll definitely need to do some coding, but definitely have some, empirical skills as well. So that's sort of like what my day looks like. Definitely a lot of meetings outside though as well. So every week I have a meeting with my advisor. So that might take the form of like a group session where other PhD students, undergraduates, master's students will be there, and we'll have like a particular topic if we're talking about a project we're working on, or if we're presenting like a paper and talking about it as a group. That's one thing we'll do. And then also when you're writing, papers. So as I mentioned, I'm doing a literature review. That is something that I have to sort of schedule meetings with my collaborators who are often outside of your institution. Not always, but that is the case in this situation. So very, very busy, a lot of different things, but I think that's what's exciting about it. Like there's always something new that's going on. So.
Very wonderful. Yeah, it's also really great to hear about that split between kind of the in the lab versus out of the lab work. Wonderful. A lot of questions came in, so I'm going to try to weave a kind of a narrative through them, hopefully. Why don't we jump to Shakira's question? I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. What major PhD programs stand out to you versus other PhD programs? And Vivian, in your case, what major MPH programs stand out? Who wants to start off this one?
I can start. So I kind of applied to like a lot of public health programs. I think I applied to 7 or 8 while in undergrad, which was fun. But why I ended up choosing to go to Pittsburgh is because for one, the University of Pittsburgh Public Health School is pretty up there. It's pretty top notch, and it's also accredited by, I think it's called the National Board of Public Health or something like that. So I think something I also think about is like, even if they say like public health, sometimes like having like an accreditation makes it like a little bit more reputable. I'm not sure how it works for like other master's programs or PhD, but this is sort of like the accrediting board for graduate public health schools. And so that was like a big draw for me. But also like this concentration is very niche. So with public health, you can kind of go into a lot of different concentrations, different fields. Like there's a big one is like epidemiology. A lot of people do their MPH in epidemiology. But there's also some people go into more like public health policy, or they're more interested in like infectious disease. And so there's sort of a lot of different things you can do in public health. But with genetics, it's a very niche. I think there's only 2 MPH programs in human genetics in the country, in the US. It's just Pitt and University of Washington. And so like, because I was really interested in genetics, that was also a big draw for me. So yeah, also with Pitt, they also do have like, you have to do like 200 hours of practicum experience as part of the program. And they help sort of place you in like a practicum experience. So this can take in the form of either like volunteering or like an internship or like a job. But basically, it's just like another way to help you sort of get experience like in public health or in genetics, which I think is really cool. And like that's part of what your advisor, they help you sort of figure out like what do you want to do as part of your practicum experience, and like help you find an opportunity that fits your interests, which I thought was really nice.
Wonderful. Sounds great. Who's next?
I can talk next about this. So I can take this question one of two ways, either what drew me to apply at the University of Houston or what drew me to accept my acceptance at the University of Houston. So I'll try to address both. So what drew me to apply was when my bachelor's degree is from the University of Houston. So I already had friends and family in the area. So that was a big draw for me. But also the cognitive development lab, the lab that I work in, matched my research interests really well. So my main interests were working with eye tracking and EEG with infants and toddlers that had been diagnosed or were at risk of autism spectrum disorder. And the University of Houston is really one of the only universities in the country that are currently doing that, both the technological method and the specific population. So I kind of curated my list with about 10 schools based off that research interest. And I applied to all 10 schools, some with fee waivers, some not. So that is definitely something to keep in mind when you're determining the list of schools, is how much you can afford in terms of sending transcripts, sending your GRE, though a lot of schools are getting rid of that requirement, stuff like that. So definitely ask for fee waivers if you're able to. And then in terms of acceptances, I was accepted at a few different schools. And what made me accept the University of Houston over all the others was when they offered me a scholarship on top of full funding. So that was a big deal. Definitely be on the lookout for separate emails from your acceptance with information about financial aid and stuff like that. But also my program is very interdisciplinary. So we are a neuroscience program, and usually that's housed in like a department of biology, but it's actually housed in the Department of Psychology, which actually gives us a lot more resources than we traditionally normally would have. They were also really good about, I wanted training and assessments, not just basic research. I actually also want to do applied research. So we were able to find someone in a different department who was able to commit to training me in those standardized assessments, which I normally wouldn't have gotten in other neuroscience programs that just focus on basic research. So definitely look out for those different collaborations that your potential advisor can bring for you, and also be on the lookout for collaborations that you can also foster yourself. Another thing is Houston has one of the biggest medical centers in the world. So that also opens up a lot of different collaborations. If I ever want to explore other populations other than autism spectrum disorder, those clinical populations are here, and there are definitely people that I can reach out to. And my advisor is very open about that kind of thing. So that's what I would say is the main draw for me.
Awesome. I really appreciate those dual perspectives as well. And Patrick, how about you?
Yeah, so I think there were two criteria, one that was well motivated, one that wasn't. So the one that wasn't well motivated was I only applied to schools that didn't require the GRE. So I am very anti-standardized testing. Like either my first or my second publication ever was basically a mathematical critique of like why the GRE and the SAT are nonsense. So that's something that's really important to me. But the other thing I was interested in was sort of flexibility. So even though I knew I wanted to get a PhD that would do some sort of like cognitive neuroscience or neuroscience work with a computational component, there are very few like specifically computational neuroscience PhDs. Most of them are either in math departments who do more mathematical biology, in psychology departments that do more of like EEG signal processing sorts of things, or you have more of like engineers who might be like, you know, even in a neuroscience department have more like a physics background. So I wanted to sort of have flexibility in what I could do because my main interest was time series. So in neuroscience, that's everywhere. So it's at every spatial scale. So I wasn't really sure what area I wanted to specialize in. So there were about, I think either 7 or 8 programs that sort of met that description and had either fee waivers or discounts on the fees for application fees, and that had guaranteed funding for like at least 5 years. So I applied to all those schools. And some were more successful than others. But I was lucky that BU was actually my top school because their neuroscience program isn't a department. It's actually distributed across the whole university. So our files and offices are kept at the medical school, but faculty are drawn from every department from, as I mentioned, math all the way to psychology, in some cases philosophy. And so all those people contribute to the program called Graduate Program in Neuroscience. And so even though that's the name that's on the degree, it's not like I'm within a particular building or university exclusively. So that was important to me to sort of have that flexibility. And so, you know, they had a generous package. They had quite a few researchers who were interested in the time series that I was. So, you know, EEG in cognitive neuroscience. So that was the reason I ended up going there. But there were plenty of candidates both at the master's and PhD level that I was very interested in. So there were also a lot of really great research assistant jobs. I actually almost, because PhD decisions often come out really late relative to other decisions, I actually almost jumped on a research assistant position I was excited about. So lots of great options for sure. I'm sure I would have been happy anywhere.
Absolutely. Tough decisions, but I'm glad everything worked out in the end. So that's wonderful. Actually, I'm going to go to another question from Shakira, because I think this is a perfect segue into Anastasia and Camille's questions as well. So would you recommend majoring in neuroscience as an undergrad if you're interested in going into a neuro-related program, or perhaps in the case of a psychology-related PhD program, majoring in psychology? How much kind of flexibility do you have to really explore during undergrad if you also kind of want to have your niche found when you're applying to graduate school?
Yeah, so I guess I can start here, and I'll talk more specifically for, I'd say like more like biology focused, like neuroscience. So even though my, like, you know, I think the reason I'm going to say that is because I think like it's more broad for cognitive neuroscience. So I can't really speak to that, but I would say the best major that I kept getting feedback on for a PhD in like biologically oriented neuroscience was actually physics, which is counterintuitive to what at least I thought when I was going in my undergraduate. And the reason why is, as it was explained to me, a lot of people with a physics background have like high knowledge of the equations that a lot of people will use to either analyze work or algorithms to sort of analyze data. You know, neurophysiology starts with the assumption that a neuron acts like a wire. So they sort of draw all of the same electronics equations from physics. And so people do really well sort of making that transition. One of my majors was obviously neuroscience. So I think like it ended up working out really well. You know, I had a strong basis in biology, a strong basis in psychology. So I think that's been serving me really well as well. But I would say like it depends on the program. So more computational focused people, a lot of faculty will say they'd rather take someone from math, computer science, or physics as opposed to biology and psychology or even neuroscience. Whereas, you know, a lot of people in cognitive neuroscience told me the opposite. And so me being interested in both, it was very difficult because I couldn't really have both at the same time. So I definitely had gaps that I had to fill either way. And so I was more interested in psychology, cognitive neuroscience. And so I think I had a really good background in that from my neuro major, but there are definitely a lot of, you know, computer science concepts and mathematical concepts that I needed to sort of fill in along the way. So I guess that's what I'd say.
Wonderful. Elizabeth, we can hop over to you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Patrick in that it really depends on what kind of neuroscience program you're going into. And there is definitely a large gap between kind of the physics and math, computer science majors versus the biology, the psychology, the neuroscience majors. I will say a lot of universities don't have a neuroscience major. So for example, the University of Houston doesn't have a neuroscience major. They only have biology, psychology, and of course, physics, mathematics. So don't let that discourage you if you don't have a neuroscience major or if you can't get a neuroscience major from applying to neuroscience programs. I had a psychology bachelor's, so I went into my program with basically no neuroscience background, but the way my program is structured is that anyone with any degree can come in and they're going to teach you the foundation of neuroscience. So actually in our degree program, we have to take 3 classes that are literally called foundations. And there's about 6 different ones. You have to take 3, and it's like foundations of behavioral neuroscience, foundations of cognitive neuroscience, foundations of developmental psychology. So you'll get your groundwork in whatever specialty of neuroscience before you really dive deep into whatever research niche. And of course, you'll be expected to do learning outside of your classes as well in terms of literature review and stuff like that. I will also say that I do a lot of undergraduate mentorship with the research assistants in my lab. And you don't need a neuroscience major either to volunteer or even work in a neuroscience lab. I have mentored people with a Spanish bachelor's, with a business bachelor's. We had one American Sign Language bachelor's. So do not be afraid to go look for neuroscience volunteering and jobs if you don't have a neuroscience major, because that's definitely not a requirement. The requirement is going to be what you're willing to put in your personality more so.
Absolutely. And I 100% agree about the majors. I was the odd one out in my lab as a medical humanities major. I was not a STEM kid. So 100%. Vivian, over to you.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with what Elizabeth and Patrick are saying. Like if you do want to go into a neuroscience field, you definitely like don't have to be in neuroscience as an undergrad. It can be helpful, I will say, like for me, for instance, like I'm coming from a neuroscience background going into like public health and genetics. And like as an undergrad, like I took one public health class, like one genetics class, like a couple bio classes. So it is kind of a pivot for me, but like I wouldn't let like where your background is like discourage you from like going to a graduate program or like applying for a job like specifically in neuroscience if that's what you want to do. And also like let's make a good point about how there are not that many neuroscience undergrad programs. Like biology is a common one, psychology is very common, but neuroscience is not super common. So I wouldn't like focus super hard on like trying to get into a neuroscience undergrad program or like only applying as a neuroscience like major, because that would also limit the amount of schools that you can apply to as well. So another thing to think about too is like with neuroscience, it's kind of like having like a bio degree. It's a little bit hard to do something with just a bachelor's in neuroscience. Like it's not impossible, but like if that's like all you have, and like it can be hard compared to like some other things. So if you're interested in math, like I would say like do math. You know, that's also what you have to do for like 4 years. So like I would say like, you know, if you really, really like neuroscience, then like sure, like do it for 4 years. But if you're not like super, super into it, or you want to like try something different before really honing in on neuroscience, like as a career, as like a graduate program, then like I would say like try something different first. You know, maybe you'll like that better than neuroscience. You never know.
Absolutely. Don't torture yourself for 4 years. If you're honestly doing a program for the sake of getting into something, you're not really interested, it's not the best. Yes, echo that for sure. All right, we have 7 more minutes to go. So I'm going to combine Camille and Anastasia's questions. Part of human nature is we do things and we realize we've done mistakes along the way. We reflect on them and we share them with younger folks, right? Who are on the same path. So what is one thing you wish you would have known when you were an undergrad student? Or are there any things that you wish you would have done differently on your path to graduate school? Regrets, reflections?
I think the biggest thing for me is like thinking about rec letters. So it was very hard during COVID to like connect with professors and like, you know, have them write you a rec letter. So I was lucky that like I was able to go back to like professors that I had in like freshman and sophomore year for rec letters. And like they really connected with me and they remembered me and they knew me. But I think something that I had wished that I had like done a little bit better is like keep up with those professors that maybe that like I would want to like hear about my grad school journey or that I would want to get rec letters from, or sort of like reach out more to like professors during COVID and try to connect with them that way. But that's something that I think people don't really think about as much, but it is like an important part of like the graduate school application process. Is like you do want to have strong rec letters because that's kind of how schools and admissions committees really get to know your personality and get to see like, okay, like are they fit for graduate school? Like how are they in an academic setting? And so I think that's something that's really important to think about. Like pretty much like as soon as you go into undergrad, I think you should start thinking about like, okay, which classes do I really enjoy? Or like which professors do I really enjoy listening to? And, you know, just get to know them and like so that they can also get to know you and write a good letter about you and recommend you. Even if you don't go to grad school, it can also be like a reference for like a job too.
Yes, investing in relationships is the most important part, right? And it never loses its value ever. Patrick, we can go to you.
Yeah, you know, I think in terms of like regrets, I might not have any just because, you know, I am like the person I am now and I have the experiences that I have now because of the decisions I made. And so I, you know, I wouldn't want to say like, oh, I wish I could have done things differently. But I would say, you know, I'll echo that last point that recommendations are definitely, at least from the programs that I was applying to, were considered the most important thing. So, you know, I am grateful that I had a lot of really good mentors and a lot of experiences or opportunities to have research experiences. So I think, you know, that definitely helped me a lot. But, you know, like GPA, for example, often like is not considered to be very important. You know, you can't have a terrible GPA, but, you know, like no one's necessarily looking for the person with a 4.0. It's more of, at least for a PhD, you know, what sort of interesting research questions can you ask? Can you show that you're committed to an extended research thread? Can you finish projects? Can people stand being around you is really important. So like for my current school, BU, our interview process was 3 days long, full days. Because they want to like figure out who you are, like what's your personality, try to figure out like the team dynamic and things along those lines. So I think like, you know, those sort of things, trying to get those research experiences, trying to, you know, just foster meaningful relationships are really important. You know, sucking up tends not to go very well either to the folks that you're trying to work with or at your own institution. It's better to just, you know, if you're excited about a particular research thread, like express that and then just, you know, be who you are in those relationships. So I think that's important. For my particular area of computational neuro, I wish that I took 7 math classes in my undergraduate. But I do wish I took more because I think that that's really important for my particular work. But I think it's very common to sort of figure out what area you're interested in, like either late in your undergrad or even early in your PhD program when you're doing like rotations or something along those lines. So, you know, if you're in sort of a place like me where there's like a big gap in terms of your understanding and what's required to do your work, like there are a lot of different ways forward to sort of fill those gaps. So you shouldn't panic, right? It's more of just, you know, making the most of your undergraduate experience to understand what you want and where you want to go, and then sort of talking to those around you to get a plan for how to make that happen.
Great advice. Elizabeth, last but not least.
Yeah, I'll second everything that Vivian and Patrick said. Hindsight is definitely 2020, so I definitely could kind of ruminate on certain things like, oh, I wish I knew I liked research so much, I wouldn't have taken those pre-med classes. Or, oh, I wish I knew the pandemic was going to hit, and then maybe I would have fostered stronger relationships with professors in person rather than having to do it online. But those aren't really things that I can change. So I think the bigger things that I would want to focus on, definitely taking the GRE a little bit more seriously, maybe studying for that a little bit sooner than I did, or being able to take it more than once. But now that a lot of schools are doing away with the GRE, that might not be as critical for some of you in the audience. In terms of my program, definitely letters of recommendation are going to be really important. And just making sure that you're really relaxed during the interview, really show yourself to the best ability, utilize kind of your career center on campus, your family members and friends that have jobs. Just do your best to practice those interviews, and be aware that it's not just going to be your potential advisor that is going to be kind of looking at you. You might have interviews with other graduate students in the lab that you're applying to, and they'll kind of report back to your advisor, and kind of share their impression of you, because you are going to be in a lab with these people for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So they need to make sure that they're going to get along with you, and that you're going to pull your weight in the lab as well. So that's really important. The other thing is I didn't realize how much coding I was going to need to do. In my neuroscience program, I only took one math class in my undergraduate, which was statistics and psychology, and all of our stats we did by hand. And of course, now in a PhD program, we're using R, we're using SAS. So I've had to pick up those languages really quickly. And then on top of that, I'm also trying to learn Ruby and MATLAB during the summer. So I'm doing a lot of boot camps and really diving into the deep end. But that's definitely something to consider, that a lot of the world is moving towards that computer science background, and you're going to have to code at one point or another. There's no getting around it.
Stats and coding, stats and coding. Good to have on hand. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, we are at time. That was a really great list of questions that y'all had in the chat there. And thank you to all three of y'all for being so candid, sharing your thoughts. Really excited to hear about the work you're doing. You have to keep us posted. Everyone, if we could join in a virtual round of applause or a physical round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you for your time. And thanks to everyone for joining. Hope you learned a little bit. Oh, thought I closed Zoom for a second. Whoops. Hope you learned a little bit about the graduate school process, a little bit more insight behind the scenes. Of course, it's a very complicated atmosphere. Academia is a very complicated equation, but hopefully, we're walking out a little bit more clear, a little bit more clarity than we were coming in before. Yes, you can email Vivian. Also reach out to Elizabeth and Patrick if you have any further questions, of course. Thanks everyone for joining. Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. We have these wonderful workshop series continuing at 11 a.m. ET tomorrow. We're on July 12th. I realize it is the morning technically for some of y'all. Spatika is going to be telling us a little bit more about actually the road to pursuing neuro after graduation. She's going to be diving a little bit deeper into kind of helping us build skills like cold contacting for research assistantships, for instance. All three of the folks here today kind of shared tips on those after college pursuits. So we'll be taking a deeper dive, practicing those skills tomorrow. So hope to see you there and have a great rest of your night or day.
Thank you, everybody.